That's Suzanne's view, and you can watch Alan Johnson's film and Suzanne's film again on our programme page anytime you like at bbc.co.uk/Victoria. Well, Suzanne Evans, Deputy Chairman of UKIP, and Alan Johnson, leader of the Labour In for Britain campaign, are both here. And we're also joined by a group of people all with strong opinions or undecided on what is best for the UK in Europe. So we'll bring all of our studio guests into the discussion in a moment. First, though, I just want to start off with Suzanne and Alan. Thank you both very much for your well-argued films. I just want to try to get from each of you, though, if you can, an overarching view of if there was one single issue that you would say to people is the reason to stay in or leave. Suzanne?
I think I made it very clear in my report. For me, it is about democracy. I believe strongly that the people that we have the opportunity to vote for and to put into power should be the people that govern us, and that we should have the ability to vote them out at the ballot box at the next election if they don't do a good job. At the moment, it works that we have the EU Commission in Brussels who make all the rules. The EU Parliament is just a sham. The EU Parliament cannot put any legislation on the table. It can't repeal any legislation. It's just there for show, really. And if you believe strongly in democracy, then I don't think you can see a future for Britain as an undemocratic nation that's ruled by another foreign power, if you like, and you should vote to leave.
Alan, your single argument?
It's that huge market of 500 million people, as your film showed. That's a bigger market than the USA, than China. In an increasingly interdependent world, that market's crucial. But it's a market with rules. It's a market with rules that protects workers, rights to paid leave, rights for part-timers to be paid the same as full-timers, etc., etc. And there's rules to protect consumers and rules to protect the environment. And actually, in this increasingly interdependent world, Britain, off in isolation, would still have to find a way to trade with Europe. And all the signs are from countries like Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein. They all trade with Europe, but they have to accept all the rules. They pay the money in and they accept free movement. So we are in the best possible place. And if we left, we'd spend lots of time and treasure just to get back to the position we're in now.
What about the point that was in Suzanne's report about pig farmers in particular, that actually the EU rules can undermine them?
Suzanne's charming and a good friend of mine. But I thought actually what she was showing there was a rule that, as Suzanne said herself, even when the EU do something right, I mean, that is obviously something that needs to be addressed. But the principle of having this rule, Suzanne made the case herself. I think the point is
it's an irrelevant rule, because we already had the rule back in 1999, long before the European...
Yes,
and can I just say
true,
the same thing about what you're talking about workers' rights as well. When did we have the first Equal Pay Act in Britain? In 1970, 3 years before we joined the European Union. It's just kind of like spreading Project Fear, I think, to say that if we leave the EU, then workers aren't going to have rights.
We never had the right to pay leave. We never had the right to paternity leave and maternity leave.
And as far as trade is concerned, you know, there are over 60 countries in the world that trade very happily with the European Union, and they're not members. And in fact, of the top 10 countries that are the biggest exporters to the EU, 6 of them don't even have a trade deal with the EU.
But
so it's
Suzanne,
not going to end.
You know as well as I do that the 10th biggest contributor to the European Union in funds is Norway. They're not members of the European Union. They pay into the European, they accept European Union, they accept every single measure, including free movement, including their part of Schengen. Now, Suzanne can't point to a single European country that is outside the European Union that has not had to accept their rules, because that's the only way to trade with this huge market.
Well, that's absolute nonsense, and as we know...
So can you point to a company?
Yeah, well, all the others that are not members, as I said, of 51 countries. Yeah, well, Russia, of course, doesn't have to. You're saying that Russia has to abide by every EU rule? Of course it doesn't.
No,
and in this country, only 5% of businesses trade with the European Union, yet all 100% of them have to abide by all the rules. That is enormously difficult, particularly for start-up companies, entrepreneurs, that are the backbone of this.
But that's not what those entrepreneurs and those businesses say.
I just want to get... Hold on 2 seconds, if that's all right, because before we move on from the issue of the economy, I just want your thoughts, Suzanne, on a point that Alan had in his film, and that is the uncertainty for business and big business saying that they're concerned. What is to stop big business just deciding... If we leave, they'll leave too.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that it's the big businesses that were saying that we must go into the ERM, which was an absolute disaster, caused one of the biggest recessions in this country's history. It was big businesses that said if we don't join the euro, the world will fall apart and we won't be able to trade again. I'm afraid big business has vested interests. They can afford to pay big money to Brussels lobbyists. And as I say, and, you know, Alan, I'm sure, could talk about big business leaders that want to stay in the EU. I could point to just as many who think it would be much better for Britain if we actually came out.
And there's a number of hedge funds, for instance, financing the Leave campaign What do they want? They want Britain as an offshore Singapore. No rules, race to the bottom, anything goes. That's precisely what
It's not
they
a race to the
They want to
bottom.
remove
We're back to
those
Project
rules.
Fear again, aren't
They
we?
want to remove those rules. Well, because you have to explain, Suzanne, what Britain would look like. We know what it's like being in the European Union. We've been in there for 40 years. You have to explain, what is it, 51st state of the United States of America? What is it, an offshore free market Singapore?
Can I turn that
is
around,
it Norway,
Alan?
Switzerland? Well, then we accept all the EU
Can I say to you,
rules.
you don't know what the EU is going to look like if we stay
Well,
in.
I know one
because
thing.
we've
I know
always
one
had
thing.
that
I know
final
one thing,
outcome
Suzanne.
hidden
You were
from
too
us.
young to vote in 75. I was there in 75. It wasn't about... We didn't vote to go into a common market. We voted to go into the European Economic Community. Political union was part of that. And you said then, the outside said then, there will be one country called Europe.
I want obviously the rest, everyone else to have their say. And I want to
hidden.
quickly talk to you both about migration before we bring in everyone else. Is the only way to control migration to this country getting out of the EU?
No, we have a points-based system for people coming in from outside the UK. Free movement is central to European Union. What your film didn't show, of course, is that Britain has more people working in developed countries than any other country in the world, more than Poland, more than anyone else. There are 2 million Brits living and working in... You walk into a pub in Brussels, all you hear is English accents.
But when it comes to net migration figures and government targets, can they only be hit if we get out?
Free movement works 2 ways. So this issue that we can have free movement to go anywhere else we like in the world, but they can't have free movement to come here. I'm afraid, you know, you're going to have to abide by those rules if you want to trade with Europe. And actually, it's not the most fundamental issue, I don't think, for most people.
Alan absolutely makes a good point there. While we're in the European Union, we have to abide by the free movement of people. That is one of the founding principles. It's immovable. If David Cameron thinks he's going to get any leeway on that, I'm afraid he's deeply mistaken.
OK, well, let's bring in our studio audience. Roddy, first of all, you're undecided. Has anything you've heard yet this morning actually changed?
I'm in the difficult position that I agree with both of them. With Alan very much on the economic side. I run a small business. We do trade in Europe, not a great deal, but enough. And the free movement, both of people and money, is extremely useful. But as Suzanne says, the eating away of the democratic process concerns me. So I'll be waiting to see what Mr. Cameron brings back from Brussels before I make a final decision.
Maeva, you're undecided as well.
I was definitely undecided, but after hearing those 2 arguments, I think I'm definitely with the staying in the EU, just for the cause of like the free movement and being able to work abroad. And as a student, I'd love to be able to study abroad.
You know, we have people in this country who go and live in America, they go and work in America, they buy property in America. We haven't had to become the 51st state of the United States in order for that to happen.
Yeah,
you have to apply for
Well,
a
that
visa.
takes, what, half a day?
Well, it's not easy at all.
So that makes it not easy.
In Amsterdam. He's lived there for 5
Introduce
years.
yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Ainsley Henn, and I'm very much on Alan's side of the argument.
Right.
I think UKIP are a bunch of lunatics that are basically racist.
Oh, for goodness sake. I mean, actually, one of the...
Oh, no, well, I'm afraid I do.
Hold on. Let Suzanne just come back on this.
One of the things that didn't come across that was cut from my report was the point that I made, you know, is it really fair that we have an open door to 28 other countries that are mostly white Christian countries, and yet the system works against the points-based system that Alan talks about for the rest of the world, discriminates against black Indian people.
But you agree with the points-based
But the
system?
point is you treat everybody equally. The EU doesn't. It prioritises white people. I think that's racist.
No, I think that's a nonsense. The free movement of people within a huge bloc, allows millions of people to move wherever they want. The points-based system limits people and gives fewer options to fewer people. You did make an interesting point about supranationalism. This idea that there's a governing body that sits above Parliament. And I'd imagine that you're also in support of the House of Lords and against House of Lords reform. And I'd also imagine that you're a monarchist and that you support... I'd also imagine that you're a monarchist and that you agree with an unelected head of state.
Hold on, this isn't about Queen having those powers, it's about the wider European Union.
No, the point is that a legislative body that sits above the democratically elected government, the House of Lords is exactly the same. The monarchy is not elected and it sits above the
So
elected government.
Yes.
I think the point is,
the
the point is there's not a perfect institution. I'm surprised at the democracy argument, because every rule that's made in Brussels has to be approved by the European Parliament, which is elected, and by the Council of Ministers that consists of elected politicians. The only reason those issues like trade, like customs, like fish conservation are issues for Brussels is because we agreed that in the treaty. Britain has agreed that. So we make
well, I'd
our
say
decisions.
we shouldn't have done. And we have
there's
been
more of a
overridden
democratic
so often at the
deficit.
Council of Ministers.
More of a democratic
Always
deficit
overridden.
in this country, as a friend here pointed out, in terms of issues like the House of Lords, the voting system that you and I both agree on.
Scotland, the West Lothian question.
let's-
That's a democratic
a whole
deficit.
range of issues.
And also look at the amount of good that's been delivered through that supranationalism. If you think about all of the member states from Eastern Europe had to sign up to the European Convention on Human Rights. That meant, for example, that homosexuality had to be decriminalised.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there are certain leaders in those EU countries that actually are very anti-gay and very homophobic, who David Cameron is now having to go and try and negotiate with. It'll be interesting to see.
But in order to join the European Union, they had to sign up to legislation that their local public would not have agreed to. It's delivered progress, it's delivered prosperity, and it's delivered better human rights.
Look, there
for
are
millions of
bring in
citizens.
some other guests around the table
that have good human rights that are not part of the
And with all
EU.
due respect, no
that's a
sane
fact.
thinking person would ever consider breaking up a union of countries that have been in conflict for hundreds of years, from the 100 Years' War to the First World War.
Let's bring in JP. Let's bring in JP, because JP, EU migrant, born in Belgium but lived in UK for 21 years. So tell us your perspective.
I believe this is about British people deciding what will be the law on the streets of Britain. I believe British people should decide what happens here, what's the law here, and we should not be outvoted. I heard Mr. Johnson's argument earlier on. In the European Parliament, in the last 5 years, in 5 out of 6 proposals, the British MEPs voted against, and we were outvoted, and those proposals went ahead regardless and became law. In the Council of Ministers, we are outvoted routinely.
But then it has to be adopted by the British Parliament.
There is majority voting and there is qualified voting on a large number of issues, and we are routinely outvoted. This is about self-determination. I came to this country 21 years ago. I integrated. I became British. And I now have the view of, I think, most people in this country, which is we should be in charge of our own destiny and our own laws.
Can I just
and
point out,
it should not be decided by a majority in Spain and in Hungary and in France and
let me just say,
all those countries.
Yeah, but as you know, the only specific issues set out in the treaties that are decided in Brussels are those issues of trade, customs, Eurozone for Eurozone countries. Hold on. We agree to every one of those in the treaty. Now you're talking as if we debate issues like the voting age in Europe, like our policing system. We don't. We decide all of that in Parliament.
You said earlier. You said that you explained the terrible situation Norway was in, or countries such as Singapore and presumably Switzerland, because they're in the same position as Norway. Oh, what a terrible feat that would be, to be like Norway and Switzerland and Singapore, some of the richest countries in the world. We should be so lucky.
Accepting every single European Union. Accepting every single European Union rule.
And we can achieve that.
That's what you want us to do.
We can
so
achieve
they
that
accept those decisions in Parliament. They accept all those decisions you were talking about in Parliament. In Norway, in Switzerland, they have not a single say in them.
They are
not a single influence.
They are extremely
Then
prosperous.
let us stay in the European Union. Let us stay in the European Union then, because that's where those countries are in everything, except they have no influence on.
Let's bring in Rosa. Let's try and get everyone.
It's democracy. They wait by the facts.
Sorry to cut across you. I'm keen for everyone to have their say. Rosa is also an EU migrant, and you think we should stay. Tell us your perspective.
Absolutely, yes. So I'm originally from Spain. I studied in Spain, so the Spanish government paid for my university education. But then I moved to England, to London 15 years ago, and I've been working for 15 years. I've got a very nice job. I've been paying my taxes. And I have to say, very sad when I saw Suzanne's video that presents migrants as people who come here looking for benefits.
No, I don't believe that.
That's the message. That's the message I got. Because I've paid very high taxes for 15 years. I think I can count on this fingers, in this hand, how many times I've used GP services. And, I contribute to this economy. I pay taxes. And I owe so much to politicians like Alan that have made possible for us to be in a European Union. And I think considering leaving the European Union is just such a backwards, it's just against progress. It's just, for me, it doesn't make sense.
I'm sure that you're a much better contributor than all the English that live on the Costa del Sol in their retirement homes and don't really contribute very much. It's great to have you here.
I think that's a bit ageist, if I may say so.
Let's bring in Helen. Helen, you want to leave the EU. Why is that?
Well, I think it's very interesting what you're saying when you're talking about business and democracy. So one of the biggest problems with the EU is the total lack of transparency in the organisation. They've got nothing like what we have in the Freedom of Information Act, which is one of the most important bastions of our democracy in the UK. And that means that things like research I've looked at recently, one of the biggest recipients of CAP grants is Coca-Cola. Yeah, like we think that these are going to helping normal people, but it's actually just going to help big businesses who would be here anyway. They don't need subsidies.
In Spain as well.
Yeah,
that's another issue.
And times when I've studied
hat.
abroad in Italy through an EU scheme that was via Erasmus, and it was one of the most disappointing experiences of my life. The EU seems completely able to pay out to Coca-Cola when it needs to, but paying out to students who are forking out limb after limb to live abroad, it took almost 3 months for me to get my grant from them. It's just completely disappointing.
I think that's a fair point on transparency. I mean, no one is saying that there are things that do not need to be reformed in Europe. We've been talking about things that need to be reformed here in this country. There's no perfect institution. Greater transparency, I think, would be excellent.
It will massively help, especially things like the European Commission, which is essentially a completely unnecessary organisation. In the British Parliament, we don't need a system of bureaucrats who sits around and thinks of new laws. We have members of Parliament to do that.
They're all in Whitehall. They're all in Whitehall.
Let's bring in Jonathan next to you. We've not heard from you yet, Jonathan. Tell us your perspective.
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue. I mean, in particular, I agree that the EU institutions are very undemocratic, very bureaucratic, and there's a lot of waste there. However, I think that's something that needs to be reformed. And having a 4-point policy of I want this, I want this, I want this, or we're out, isn't the right way to reform the EU. And I just want to touch on some of the vague economic claims that Suzanne is making, because you touched on entrepreneurs and startup businesses.
And
I am an entrepreneur. I do have a startup business, and you say that only 5% of British businesses trade with the EU. Now, you know what, my business, we do much more trade with the US than the EU. Yeah. However, you know what you need to build a business, particularly an early stage, high risk, fast growing business? You need people who are willing to take a risk and invest in you with the chance that all that money is going to disappear. You also need people to carry out those jobs. And as a business which, we're not based in London, my business and the majority of my team is based in Newcastle. And there isn't the same access to private investment in the northeast as there is here, particularly for the earliest stage startup businesses. Now, what we get from the EU, from the European Investment Bank and the ERDF, is funds that allow venture capital organisations to invest in businesses like mine with the backing of private investment. Now, I can tell you for a fact that without that inward investment, my business wouldn't be here today because we were too risky for people to invest in. But that fund has resulted in more than 50% match funding from other individuals, thousands of jobs created,
and actually, of course, where you're getting that money from is not the EU. You're getting it from European Union member state taxpayers. It's not the EU's money, it's taxpayers' money. And can I also just add, one of the interviews I did for the report that was cut from the final report was an interview with the leader of Kent County Council. And he, of course, gets grants from the EU. And he was saying, frankly, sometimes the conditions that are put on them, they're so difficult to enforce, we might as well not just have the money. And this is, I think, again, if we leave the European Union, we'd have all that money to save and we could still invest in businesses like your startup. And we'd all be very glad to see that happen. But without all that red tape, without it going through the middleman, without the middleman associated costs, and without the kind of restrictions and regulations that the EU, just because it likes to meddle, sticks on them.
So just a quick response.
No, I don't agree. Actually, in the North East, they're net recipients, as they are in Wales, as they are in Yorkshire and Humber. But the whole point of this is we agreed, this idea that Europe is always something done to Britain. Britain is a major player in the European Union. We've agreed that these structural funds would be these structural funds. Yes, that's right. That's what you do in any organisation, in the United Nations, in NATO. We're not having a referendum on being members of that. In any international organisation, you cede some of your sovereignty for the greater good, and that's what we're doing.
Being in NATO isn't about ceding sovereignty.
Okay, let's not start talking about NATO.
Nobody under 58 has been asked about this.
Yeah.
Well, they are going to
Nobody
be
under
now.
58. So I believe the sovereignty rests with the people. We lend it to the politicians, but it's not theirs to give away. It is not theirs to give away. And we should have a say on it. Nobody under 58 has agreed
That's not what we're arguing
transfer
about.
our sovereignty.
We're arguing about
to
how you
Brussels.
vote, not whether you have the referendum.
I want David to come in. Sorry, you've said a lot, and David hasn't actually said a thing yet. So, David, you join in the discussion.
I actually want to come out. Where everybody seems to be afraid is the trade deal with the EU after. Are you telling me that the Germans are going to turn around and say, we're not going to sell our cars to you?
No.
No, they're not. They're not.
No, they're going to apply a tariff to the cars that we send to them. Nissan,
Well, we can
Toyota,
do the same to
It's
them.
not in their interest.
It wouldn't be in
do the
their
same.
interest.
It is not in their
EU,
interest.
Listen,
the EU
these companies have
exports
set
more to
up
us
in
than what we
Britain
export to
because
them.
they have tariff-free exports to the rest of Europe. Listen, even the Leave campaign say we have to have these trade agreements with Europe. You can't trade without a trade agreement.
we could trade with the...
Of course you can't.
We will trade
For
with the
goodness
world.
sake, I've
course you
told you
can't.
If
already.
we trade with the rest of the world,
Top
we'd be much
countries
better off.
export.
Look,
They don't
we do
have a
trade with the rest of the world.
India,
We do
China,
trade with the rest of the
Russia,
world.
Russia,
But 50% of our exports are to Europe. We can only do that through a trade agreement. You will not be able to trade. Norway can't. Switzerland can't. Liechtenstein can't, if you want to be that ridiculous. Iceland can't, without signing up. Sorry. Look, let me just tell you. Everyone's entitled to their own view. No one's entitled to their own facts. You cannot trade with Europe without a trade agreement. If you pull out of the trade agreement, you're going to have to renegotiate.
I'm going to have to stop you all.
In fact, Russia, Brazil, China, Japan, the USA all trade without a trade agreement. I'm sorry.
We are right out of time.
That's not true.
We knew this would be a heated debate. It has been. Thank you all very much.